Hello, and thank you for joining me today for another presentation in the GreyLearning webinar series. I want to once again thank Tamron for sponsoring this series of presentations. Today, we're going to be talking about creating great black and white images. I'm Tim Gray, and I have been photographing for a very long time. In fact, for so long that when I first got started, I thought this was a great image. Rest assured, I now realize it's not. It was a lot of fun to create. It was a lot of fun to process in the old wet darkroom. But I then realized that it's just a tree with a sunburst, which is cool, but it's not one of my best photos, and yet it remains a favorite photo because it does represent some special memories in photography. But this was back in the day of black and white, and you might say that at the time I didn't have a choice. Now, I'm not old enough to remember the time when there was no color photography, but when I got started, seriously anyway, in photography, my only option taking a high school black and white photography class was black and white photography. There were no digital cameras back then, it was all film, and it was all black and white. Color existed, but not in my class. And so I was sort of forced, you might say, to adopt black and white photography, to use black and white film, to process that film in the darkroom, to make prints in the darkroom. It was loads of fun. It's what really drove my passion for photography. It got that started. And it was interesting. Back then, my feeling was artistic photography had to be black and white. If it was in color, it wasn't artistic. Color was just documentary. Black and white, that was art. I've since evolved and improved my perspective on photography, you might say, and gotten to the point where I absolutely love color photography, but there's still a soft spot in my heart for black and white photography. And so today I'm going to talk a bit about creating great black and white photos, essentially providing some tips on how you can produce better results overall, how you can produce more creative results in some cases, just kind of an overall guide to some of the things I recommend keeping in mind when you're working with black and white images or anticipating the creation, the interpretation of a color photo into a black and white. Now, of course, there are a variety of software tools that you can use, and in many respects, they're mostly the same. And what I mean by that is that when it comes to black and white imaging, you can achieve similar results with a wide variety of tools. I will talk about several different tools. Initially, I'm going to focus my attention on Photoshop and Lightroom, since those are the software tools that most photographers are using in general. I will talk a bit about third-party tools toward the end of today's presentation, give you some suggestions, some food for thought there. I know there are some questions about one app in particular that has raised some concern. But let's start off talking about the actual initial capture. And one of the most important things, I would say, when it comes to creating black and white images, and quite frankly, I consider this important for any image, is to actually shoot in RAW. So in your camera, you have a RAW capture option, more than likely, I hope, and you probably have a JPEG capture option. There have been cameras over the years that even offered a TIFF option. That's not something I would generally recommend, in large part due to the huge file size. But RAW capture gives us tremendous flexibility. So here I'm using Adobe Bridge to browse some images. If I double click to open up an image, you'll see that that takes me directly to Adobe Camera Raw. And so I could use a variety of different tools to process the RAW capture, keeping in mind that the RAW capture, we could say, isn't really a photo per se, in that it doesn't have all of the pixel data. It needs to be essentially demosaicked, to be processed from just the information gathered by the image sensor, along with possibly a little bit of additional processing metadata from the camera. We need to then convert that information, that data, into actual pixel values. And by using RAW capture, you're giving yourself the maximum amount of information from the camera, as well as maximum flexibility. And I'll talk about a couple of those issues here in just a moment. But the bottom line is, as far as I'm concerned, especially for black and white photography, it is absolutely critical that you use your camera's RAW capture mode, not JPEG. And I'll show you some examples of the issues you might run into otherwise in just a moment. In addition, it is important to expose to the right. And what that means is to create an exposure that is as bright as possible without clipping highlight detail. I'll talk more about why this is important shortly, or I should say another contributing factor that just makes it all the more important to expose to the right. I think the best way to think about this rule of thumb to expose to the right is that in photography, we're capturing information. And specifically, that information is light. I think it's also fair to describe the opposite of information in this type of context as noise. The opposite of light, I guess you could say, is dark, but when we don't have enough light, essentially the camera or our software needs to try to figure out what those other values are that it can't quite see very well, and the result is noise. Really, it means that we're adding amplification to the equation, and so now we're boosting the signal, we're adding gain, we're increasing the gain value, and that's going to produce noise. By exposing to the right, we're maximizing the amount of information, the light that we're gathering, and we're minimizing the amount of noise, all other things being equal. And what that generally means is that we want to capture an image. We want to use an exposure where the histogram, and of course we would be evaluating this on the back of the camera, hopefully, not after the capture in post-processing, for example, here in Adobe Camera Raw. We want that histogram to be shifted as far to the right as possible. In other words, we want an exposure that is as bright as possible, but with a very, very important caveat. We do not want to lose information in the highlights. In other words, we could just expose to the right to an extreme degree and have an image that's 10 stops overexposed with absolutely no information, just white pixels. That obviously would be silly. So when we say we want to expose to the right, it's brightening the exposure as much as possible, or shifting the histogram to the right as much as possible without clipping highlight detail. I think this is, fair to say, helpful for most photographic images, for most digital captures, but it can be especially important for black and white images where image quality can be a particular challenge, as we'll address shortly. So in this case, we have an exposure that I would like to tell you is absolutely perfect. I would like to tell you that I properly exposed to the right and that I have brightened up the exposure right up to the edge of losing highlight detail without actually losing any of that highlight detail. But that is not the case here. I can tell you that I have not clipped any shadow detail, so the blacks have not lost detail. You can see below the tree, the shadow there, for example, is certainly very dark, but there's still detail there that I could extract if need be. But this is not an optimal exposure by virtue of, as you can see on the histogram, there's a little bit of a gap over toward the right side. I could have been even brighter with this exposure and still not have lost any highlight detail. And that, as a result, would give me better chances with my shadows. It would make the shadows brighter, but I could always darken the shadows if I prefer. But if I have dark shadows that I brighten, the result is going to be increased noise. So I want to expose my images as brightly as possible without clipping any of the highlight detail. So let's see how far we can go. I'm holding the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh and increasing the value for exposure and seeing how far I could go without clipping. And of course, I don't get the most accurate view here because you can see with 2 3/4 stops, I certainly hope I was not underexposed by 2 3/4 stops. But the issue here is that the exposure slider is not exactly linear, so if instead we simply pay attention to the histogram itself and adjust it right to the point where, a very technical term, the right edge starts to squish a little bit, it's somewhere around about a half stop. So I could have been about a half stop brighter with this exposure and still retained all of the highlight detail with no clipping. Half stop maybe is not going to make an outrageous difference, unless, of course, I really want to bring out lots of shadow detail. If I'm going to be brightening up my shadows, it's all the more important that I've exposed to the right in order to maximize the information and minimize the noise. Again, all other things being equal, I naturally want to think about my ISO setting and all of the other factors that relate to noise, heat buildup, long exposure times, etc. I also think it is worth keeping in mind that you can actually set your camera to capture in black and white mode even if you're shooting RAW, except the photo will still not be in black and white. So I'm sure you're probably aware of the fact that most of the settings in your camera do not affect RAW capture. In essence, there are a few exceptions here, but the simplistic way to think of this is that the only camera settings that affect the actual raw data are the ISO setting, which impacts noise, the aperture setting, which in large part affects depth of field, and the shutter speed, which mostly is affecting the rendition of movement in the frame. Almost all other settings in the camera simply do not apply to RAW captures. There are some exceptions, so for example, there's some processing that helps to protect highlights in some of the newer model cameras. There's long exposure noise reduction. So there are some other options in your camera that affect RAW capture data. In other words, there will be a little bit of processing of that data before the RAW capture is saved. So you're getting something that's not exactly RAW, it's just minimally processed and only based on settings you've actually applied in camera. Things like converting to black and white, enhancing saturation if it were a color photo, enhancing contrast, applying sharpening, those sorts of image adjustments in the camera actually do not affect your raw capture. The only thing they're affecting really is the preview that you're seeing in your camera. And of course, in many cases, there will be a JPEG preview embedded in your raw capture as well. So you might have the experience where you've set your camera to black and white, and then you load your images, maybe bring them up into Bridge, and initially you see black and white thumbnails, but as Adobe Bridge builds the previews based on the actual raw captures, suddenly you start to see the images in color. So if the raw capture is going to still be in color, why would you set your camera to black and white mode? Well, put simply, it gives you a better sense of what the final result might be. By evaluating the image on your LCD in black and white, you get a better sense of what's working and what's not working. You might catch things that you would otherwise miss. So if you know that you're likely to process a lot of images into black and white mode, then you very well may want to set your camera. Again, just keep in mind that it is just a metadata setting. And so just as I could set my camera to black and white here in Camera Raw, if I've chosen the option to convert to grayscale, I still have that color information in my original raw capture. So it's worth keeping in mind that setting your camera to black and white with raw capture is really not changing the raw capture per se. Really, it's just changing the actual preview that's embedded and, more importantly, giving you the opportunity to evaluate the image on the camera's LCD in that black and white preview. Now, when it comes to processing in Camera Raw, for example, I could convert to grayscale, and that will give me a black and white interpretation of the image. And then, of course, I can choose my mix, and we'll talk about the grayscale mix a little bit later. But my recommendation is to always work in RGB, to work with the full color information because it gives you greater flexibility. Now, if you're a Lightroom user, and I will do some of my work today in Lightroom to give you a better sense of kind of the differences between one approach versus the other, in Lightroom you don't really have this distinction, but in Photoshop you can choose to process the raw capture as a color image or as a black and white image. And my recommendation is to keep the image in color in the context of processing your original RAW and then convert to black and white within Photoshop. That gives you more information to work with. Instead of having a single grayscale channel, you'll then have red, green, and blue color channels to work with, which certainly can come in handy for a variety of different adjustments. And so in the context of a image that you're converting in Adobe Camera Raw, that simply means that I would leave the Convert to Grayscale checkbox turned off. For Lightroom, again, there's not this distinction, so you would just be choosing the interpretation within the Develop module, in other words, choosing that black and white treatment. And then we get to the issue of bit depth, and this is one of the key reasons that I prefer to capture in RAW as opposed to JPEG. To be sure, with a raw capture, the color temperature or the white balance setting that you establish in camera is purely a metadata setting. It has no impact on the actual raw data being gathered by your image sensor, which means that I can adjust the overall color temperature after the capture when I'm processing my raw image, for example, here in Adobe Camera Raw, and there is no penalty in terms of image quality when it comes to adjusting that white balance in the raw conversion or raw processing stage of my workflow. So most of these other settings I can just play with, but one of the most significant advantages, yes, of course, that color temperature adjustment after the fact is great. The fact that we have a little bit more exposure latitude so we can get away with an image that's a little overexposed versus underexposed, to a certain degree in any event. But one of the greatest advantages of raw capture is the fact that we can process the image to a higher bit depth. In Lightroom, essentially that's just always happening. If you have a raw capture, you're working in a 16-bit per channel workspace, and so there's no adjustment. You can't choose, for example, to work in 8-bit per channel mode in Lightroom. In Adobe Camera Raw and other tools for processing raw captures, you have the ability to choose your bit depth, and I cannot stress enough how important it is to work at a high bit depth with black and white images. I'll show you a visual example of one of the most important issues there shortly, but keep in mind that with a black and white image, the net result is a single channel. It's not red, green, and blue. Now it's just shades of gray. And if we're working in 8-bit per channel mode, we have 256 shades of gray. That's not very many. Whereas if we're working in 16-bit per channel, we have 65,536 shades of gray available, 2 raised to the power of 16. And in the context of Adobe Camera Raw, I can go to my workflow option. So down below the image preview, I have a set of options here that indicate the settings, the color space, and the bit depth. I'll go ahead and click on that summary, and you'll see that I get my workflow options dialog here, and I can choose between 8 bits per channel and 16 bits per channel. And again, for color images, this is reasonably important. It could be important depending on the specific image and the overall exposure and how strong of an adjustment you need to apply to the image. But for black and white images, I consider this an absolute must. If you're a photographer who captures in JPEG and you have an affinity for black and white, I strongly recommend that you start capturing in RAW. It will improve the quality of your images significantly, whereas for color images, it is much less important. So definitely 16 bits per channel. Let's take a look at a specific example of why that's so important, and that would be posterization. Posterization, the loss of smooth gradations of tone or color in your images. Now, this is difficult to simulate in the context of a digital display. We would really need to evaluate prints that were made from a 16-bit versus an 8-bit per channel grayscale image. But I suspect most of you have seen evidence of posterization at some point. Now again, with an online digital presentation here, it can be a little bit tricky to actually create posterization and to know whether or not you're going to be able to see it. So to make sure that you can see it very, very clearly, I have a posterize adjustment layer here, and as I reduce the number of levels, you'll start to see that we transition from a very smooth gradation of tones in the sky. So the sky here goes from, about a medium gray to a rather dark gray in a very smooth gradation. But as I posterize the image, you'll start to see that instead of a smooth gradation, I start to see these bands of different tonal values. So posterization is exactly this, the loss of smooth gradations of tone or color. So here we're seeing it in the sky, and smooth skies, a cloudless sky, that is the most common area where you're going to see posterization. I'm sure most of you have seen prints where a black and white print where the sky does something like this, maybe not quite so exaggerated as this, but where we have this obvious adjustment. The gradation is no longer smooth. We get this banding in the sky. And of course, it could go to an extreme level, and now we have basically 5 shades of gray up in the sky. That would be an absurdly extreme example that you're probably never going to run into. In addition to these bands, notice that the actual transitions, the gradations here, are very pixelated, kind of a dithering pattern. And again, that is because we've lost the smooth gradations. We've essentially reduced the number of possible tonal values. So as I apply an adjustment, if I were to increase contrast for the image, for example, then I'm reducing the number of tonal values that are available in the image. So if we're working with 8 bits per channel, we might go from 256 shades of gray down to a couple hundred, or down to 150, or down to 100, and somewhere in there, we're very likely to see some visible posterization. With a color image, this is not anywhere nearly as likely. Bearing in mind, with an 8-bit per channel image, there are, if it's a grayscale image, a total of 256 total possible tonal values available. If that were a color image instead, still 8 bits per channel, now we have 16.7 plus million color values available. And at 16-bit per channel, again, we have 65,536 tonal values for a grayscale image. It's over 281 trillion for a color image. With 65,000 plus possible tonal values, even with a very strong adjustment, we're still going to be left over with plenty, in general, plenty of tonal values to maintain smooth gradations. In other words, if you think that we can get a good smooth result with 256 shades of gray, then even with extreme adjustments on a 16-bit per channel image that has, or starting with in any event, possibly, and these are all theoretical maximums, your actual image might start off with fewer, but we are ending up with 16-bit per channel, 65,536 in theory, probably less, but even with fewer to start with, and even with strong adjustments, we're still likely going to end up with far more, significantly more than 256 shades of gray. And so I just can't stress enough how important it is to work in 16-bit per channel for black and white images. It's just an absolute requirement as far as I'm concerned. And so Catherine's got a good question here. Does Photoshop Elements allow you to work with the same tools that we're showing? And for the most part, yes. Obviously, there are some exceptions in terms of the specific adjustments, but in the basic context of black and white, yes. What we're talking about would be applicable, obviously with a little bit of translation, but by and large, the same basic concepts would apply in Photoshop Elements. And then Doug asks if changing the color space changes a raw image. I assume that refers to in the camera. And the answer then is no. If you change your color space, many cameras, for example, allow you to choose between sRGB versus Adobe RGB in the camera, and that does not affect your actual raw capture data. In essence, what it will affect is the preview on the back of your LCD, on the back of your camera, and the histogram. And the way I generally describe this is that choosing Adobe RGB will usually give you a little bit more accurate histogram, and choosing sRGB will generally give you a little bit more pleasing preview image, so especially in color, obviously. All right, so moving right along here, and we will take a look at one other concept here. And this is something that I've struggled with. I don't know if many of you maybe have had this issue or not. But in the context of black and white photography, I started off, as I mentioned, with black and white. Then I started migrating more and more and more into color. So now the majority of my photography is in color, and black and white becomes, a minor part of my photography overall. Still something that I enjoy very much, but it's not the majority of my photos. But it's funny because sometimes, this photo, for example, we were out in the Palouse region of eastern Washington state, amazing farmland with these rolling hills and old barns and abandoned farmhouses. We lead photo workshops out there each June, and we often seek out some of the more colorful subjects. So this is a field of canola, for example, and we've got these rolling, intersecting hills and the clouds, and it's just a wonderful scene. And sometimes we'll have an attendee on one of these workshops who does everything in black and white. And there are times when I feel like that's just crazy, because this is all about the color. Why would you shoot this in black and white? And yet the fact of the matter is that even with a color subject, you can still produce very interesting, very nice photos in black and white, a black and white interpretation. Black and white works wonderfully well when we have nice textures or when the color is not important to the scene. But even in situations where the color is important, black and white can work out remarkably well. I've seen and produced many great photos that I'm very impressed with, very happy with, of the canyons, Antelope Canyon, for example, the slot canyons in Arizona. And you think, what? It's all about the color. But it's not all about that red rock color. It's also about the texture. And so in situations where you have interesting textures or variations in tonality, so bright sunlight versus shadows, for example, in this image, you might consider black and white. And in large part, I think of that as letting go of color sometimes. Even in situations where color was part of the reason that you captured the image in the first place, consider whether or not black and white might work. And you might be surprised at just how often black and white does provide a good solution. So I want to switch to Lightroom here. And in fact, let's go ahead and take a look. We'll kind of switch back and forth between both Lightroom and Photoshop just to illustrate, because I know that most photographers are using Lightroom or Photoshop, some photographers using Lightroom and Photoshop, and so those are some of the more common tools. So I'll kind of just show you both examples here. The same concept, once again, applies with most software that you might use for creating a black and white interpretation of a color image. And the basic idea is that we want to, in theory at least, remove the color information. More to the point, we want to choose how to interpret the color information. And so in the context of Photoshop, that process would involve adding an adjustment layer. And so once I've opened a color image that I want to process as a black and white, keeping in mind, once again, I would process the raw capture as color, bring it into Photoshop, and then convert to black and white. And so, for example, I would then add a black and white adjustment layer. So at the bottom of the Layers panel, I would click on the Add Adjustment Layer button, the half black, half white circle icon, and then I would choose black and white from the pop-up that appears. That will add a black and white adjustment layer. You can see that creates a black and white preview, and then I have a series of sliders that I can choose from. I also have the on-image adjustment that we'll take a look at in just a moment in the context of Lightroom. Within Lightroom, I would simply select the image that I want to work with, go to the Develop module, and then I can either, under Treatment, choose black and white, or I'll go ahead and hide the histogram for the moment. I can scroll down to the HSL, Color, and B&W section and choose black and white. Either option is perfectly fine. And then once again, I have my sliders, my black and white mix sliders, as well as my on-image adjustment tool. So these operate essentially the same. These basic features, especially the sliders, are available in most tools that enable you to process your black and white images. And so the basic concept, very, very simple. We adjust the luminance values based on the underlying color values. And so, for example, I could brighten up the yellows, which are for the most part found in that stucco wall. It's kind of an orangish yellow color. So the brighter areas are more yellow. And so as I increase the value for yellow, I'm brightening, or I could darken with a negative value. I'm brightening or darkening the areas that had been yellow, or the areas in this case that had been orange. I'll get a more dramatic effect. The shutters, I think they were green, weren't they? Now I can't remember. Are they green? Are they aqua? Are they purple? Fortunately, I don't have to remember. If I do know what color an object is within the scene, I could drag that slider, but that's where the on-image adjustment tool can be very helpful. And again, this is available in both Photoshop, so I have the little hand here with the two arrows, or inside of Lightroom, same with Adobe Camera Raw. And so I can click to activate that tool, and then move my mouse over an area of the image, and then drag in order to brighten or darken that area. So with my mouse over the shutter that I couldn't remember the color of, if you take a look over on the right side in the black and white section, you'll see that the color value, the numeric value for the green slider, is currently highlighted. It's a -22 value there. It's highlighted, which indicates that the area that my mouse is over right now is predominantly green. If I drag out over the stucco, then you'll see the orange value gets highlighted, indicating that the area under my mouse is predominantly orange. So now I know which slider I would drag. Of course, hopefully I remembered what color the shutters were anyway, but I don't even have to move over to the slider. I can simply leave my mouse directly on the image and then click and drag upward to brighten or downward to darken. And as I do that, you'll see that the slider is moving as well. So I can just simply point to an object in the image. Let's assume that I want to brighten the shutters and darken the wall. I can simply click and drag upward on the shutters, click and drag downward on the wall, or if I wanted the opposite, I could click and drag upward on the wall, click and drag downward on the shutters. And so this to me is very fundamental, but incredible in terms of the power it gives me to interpret my image, to be able to go through and adjust my luminance values based on the original underlying color. Now, to be sure, in this case, I was focused mostly on the orange and yellow and the green. I do recommend that you go through all of the sliders. So here's the blue slider that I haven't touched yet, and dragging through the extremes, it appears to do nothing. And magenta, just a tiny, tiny little effect in the stucco. The magenta, I'm not seeing much of anything. And the reds, in this case, I have an image that has basically just greens and kind of orangish values. And so those are probably the only sliders that are going to be significant in terms of impact, the orange, yellow, and green. But it's a good idea to go explore those other sliders just to make sure you're not missing out on anything. And speaking of missing out on something, one of the things that I find happens somewhat regularly is that a photographer will go to a color image that they think probably they should interpret as black and white. And so there we have a little bit of an adjustment there and maybe just a little bit of a bump in clarity. And so I've applied some basic adjustments. And now I decide, you know what, that color is not really adding anything to the image. And I actually sort of think it's subtracting, it's detracting from the image. There's no benefit to that color. I think I'd like to go into the black and white mode. So I switch to black and white, or in the context of Photoshop, I might add a black and white adjustment layer. And often I find that at that point, photographers consider themselves to be finished. And that's not when we should be finished. We've only just begun in the context of a black and white image. You might have gone through and applied a wide variety of adjustments to the color interpretation of the image. But when it comes to the black and white interpretation, you've essentially only done one thing. You've clicked the option to convert to black and white. At this point, we've essentially stripped out the color information, not necessarily literally if we're using a non-destructive workflow as I have been doing here, but we've really only just gotten started in terms of interpreting that color image as black and white. And so I want to revisit all of my other, or at least many of my other adjustments. I want to go take a look at that white point and actually refine it. So I'm holding the Alt-Option key on Windows so that as I drag the white point slider, I get a clipping preview, and I can push right to the edge of clipping without actually clipping any pixels. I can do the same thing for the shadows. In this case, though, I think with a black and white interpretation, now those tonal variations become that much more important. I might want to embellish them a little bit. Maybe I want to darken the shadow value, use a negative value for shadows. Maybe I want to increase the clarity a little beyond what I might normally do. I'll tone down the highlights just a touch there so the contrast isn't too extreme. But something like this, for example, in other words, revisiting all of the various adjustments. In the context of Photoshop, what that often means is once I've decided that I'm happy with my overall interpretation, so maybe I want to darken up the greens here just a little bit and maybe brighten the yellows, maybe somewhere in there, I still want to consider other adjustments, either revisiting any previous adjustments I've applied or adding new adjustments. So, for example, adding a curves adjustment for the image. So maybe setting my black point right about there. And the white point looks to be pretty good. Perhaps a little bit of an S curve to enhance overall contrast. and a variety of other adjustments that I might want to apply. Again, the key point is to keep in mind that once you've transitioned from a color image to a black and white image, if that was sort of at the end of your workflow, you were applying all of your basic adjustments, then you decided to interpret as a black and white, or then you got to the point that you were ready to convert to black and white, be sure to revisit all of those basic adjustments and refine them as appropriate to your new interpretation. Very often, you might need wildly different, or at least significantly different adjustments for the black and white interpretation as compared to the color interpretation of the photo. I think it can also be helpful as part of that overall process to enhance the textures for your image. Very often I find that the photos that I want to interpret as a black and white as opposed to color are images that had a lot of texture. And here again, with this photo, once again in the Palouse, I've got these rolling, incredibly rolling hills covered with a wheat crop, and I have these wonderful clouds up in the sky. There's a lot of color here. Part of the motivation was color, to be sure, but the textures are quite interesting as well. So if I were going to interpret that image as a black and white, I might want to enhance those textures. We've already seen in the context of Lightroom that I can simply increase the value for clarity. I could also use the dehaze adjustment perhaps with certain images. In Photoshop, we don't have quite the same set of options, not quite the same flexibility. However, Photoshop CC now gives us the option to use Camera Raw as a filter. And I have found that this has been a tremendous benefit to my workflow in terms of applying certain adjustments. So for example, distortion correction that I don't need to necessarily apply, or if I need to fine tune a little bit, if I didn't get it quite right with my original raw processing, I can still apply the effect after the fact using Adobe Camera Raw as a filter. So I'm going to make a copy of my background image layer. I don't want to alter the original background image, so instead I'll drag the thumbnail down to the Create a New Layer button down at the bottom of the Layers panel. So just drag and drop the thumbnail for the background layer in order to create a background copy layer. And now I can go to the Filter menu and then choose Camera Raw Filter from that menu, and that will bring up the Camera Raw dialog, but I'm applying that Camera Raw set of adjustments as a filter directly to my background copy layer. Now, of course, that background copy layer is a color image because I'm using a black and white adjustment layer to interpret that image as a black and white. So it might be a little bit tricky to interpret what adjustment level, how strong of an adjustment I want to apply. But here's my recommendation. When in doubt, take it a little bit too far. So I've increased clarity very significantly here. The wheat field, you might notice, it kind of looks over-sharpened. This is a look that I refer to as being kind of crunchy. It just looks a little over-processed. That's okay. I'm going to leave that a little stronger than I think it should be, and then click OK. Now, in some cases, you might find that that over-processing actually works perfectly fine in the context of your black and white interpretation. In this case, it's still a little bit too strong. But never fear. I can, with that background copy layer active, and I might first of all rename this so I don't get confused as to why it's there. I'll just double-click on the name, and we'll call this Camera Raw Adjustments or Filter or whatever makes sense for you so you know why that layer is there. With that layer active, I can go up to the top of the Layers panel and take a look at that opacity control. I can click on the pop-up and drag that slider to reduce the opacity so that I'm mitigating the effect. And I think, maybe right about there looks to be pretty good. I could also use the scrubby slider here. I can point to the word opacity and click and drag to the left to reduce the value and to the right to increase the value. And of course, I can turn off the visibility for that, in this case, Camera Raw Adjustments layer. So turn off the visibility, then turn it back on to get a better sense of the actual effect. I could even use layer masks and get even more sophisticated if I wanted to in terms of fine-tuning the overall effect, maybe applying a stronger effect to the sky as opposed to the wheat in the foreground, for example. And then we have a vignette control. So this is something that I often, very often, I would say, use in the context of black and white images. When we have only the tonality working for us, very often the edges of the frame kind of seem to just bleed off. We don't have as much in the way of that kind of bookending that we might otherwise have with some color contrast. And so I very often like to add a vignette. Also, I find that for me personally, when I'm using a black and white interpretation of a photo, it's very often in order to, or partly motivated by, an interest in having a little bit more dramatic, a little more dramatic impact for the photo. And so black and white can work very well there as well. In the context of Photoshop, I might use an adjustment layer combined with a layer mask, but once again, this is an area where I found that using Camera Raw helps very much. So I'm going to go ahead and repeat that process here, making a background copy. I'll just go ahead and rename this. I'll just call it Camera Raw Filter. And then I could go to the filter menu once again and choose Camera Raw Filter. And then I can go to my effects set of adjustments, and there we'll see our post-crop vignetting. I'm going to switch over to Lightroom here, and we can essentially do the exact same thing. If I scroll down on the right panel within the Develop module, I can get down to my post-crop vignetting, and I can darken those edges. I'm going to exaggerate the darkening a little bit so we can explore these other settings, the other controls here. And again, virtually any software that you're using is going to offer a similar type of vignetting control where we can darken the edges. So I can move the midpoint inward or outward. I can adjust the roundness so it's more rectangular versus circular in terms of that overall shape for my vignette. And then I can adjust the feathering, the blending. So I'm going to have no feathering, essentially no blending at all, or a nice smooth blending, which is what I would typically do. And so something like that, maybe decreasing the strength just a little bit. Oh, maybe somewhere in there, a little bit more feathering. Maybe move it inward just a little bit. Maybe something like that. And the effect I'm usually going for is that in some respects, the bottom left corner, it's a little more obvious, but the other three corners, it's not very obvious that I've added a vignette. But when I turn it off, suddenly it's like somebody turned on the lights in a darkened room. There's a pretty dramatic difference between the before and after. And so usually I'm going for an effect where there's not an obvious vignette necessarily, but where the effect is actually helping to frame up the overall image. And so instead of our eye just kind of wandering off away from the edge of the photo, we sort of stay contained. It feels more like there's something of a frame around that image, and it also can add a little bit more drama. It can help focus our attention on a key subject and otherwise help us to just get a better sense of that overall effect, what we're, where we're trying to keep your eyes, essentially. So that's pretty straightforward. In many cases, though, I think photographers forget about the fact that we can not only darken the edges or the corners, we can also lighten them. And very often I find that that can be a nice effect also. Now, in theory, this means that we're essentially trying to get the viewer's eyes to drift away from the photo, to drift right off the edge of the printed image, for example. Obviously, that's not what we're really trying to accomplish, but I do find, while a darkening vignette is usually aimed at keeping you contained, at framing up the overall image, a lightening vignette can work very nicely in terms of just having a nice graceful transition for the image. Now, in this particular case, I have a little bit of a gradation for the subject matter here. This is the interior of the Oculus in Lower Manhattan, so if you've not had a chance to go check out the interior of that, I certainly recommend it. And if I lighten those edges, I think it actually helps, especially down at the bottom. It adds a little more drama. And sure, you could say that now my eye is being led away from the image, but I think we have a strong enough center of interest here that that's not really going to happen. And so in many cases, lightening up the edges of the photo can actually have a very nice impact as well. All of our other adjustment settings are still available, of course. I'm simply choosing to lighten up the edges rather than darken those edges. And then we have the ability to apply a tint to the image. And we'll actually take a look at this in sort of two contexts. So I'll come back and open the same image inside of Photoshop as well. Let me just close out these other images here. The tint is one of those things that can add a bit of a mood to the image. It also can add a sense of, sort of warmth or a sense of age or timelessness. And so with this photo, for example, I was definitely going for, at least in theory, a timeless quality. But then I felt that I wanted to go for a little bit of an older timeless quality, a timelessness in the past as opposed to in the present. And so I think a vignette that gives it a sense of age actually can, or it's not a vignette, rather a color tint that gives a sense of age there can be nice. Now, of course, the stereotypical one would be a sepia tone effect, but we can actually use any color we'd like. And in the context, I've already, in this case, started with a black and white image, but in the context of Photoshop, I would actually just use the black and white adjustment and turn on the tint checkbox. And then I can click the color swatch associated with the tint checkbox to bring up the color picker, and I can choose any color of the rainbow. Now, it probably becomes obvious very quickly that I generally want a value that has a relatively low saturation. So I would use a low, low, low saturation value, very low saturation value. And then I can adjust the hue. In the context of a sepia tone, I'm usually somewhere in the low 40s, give or take, for that hue. So I get kind of this slightly, a little hint of orange, but kind of that yellowish brown type of a tone to it. But the point is that I can simply enable that tint option and then work with my color. So click on the color swatch and choose a color within the color picker to assign that color tint to the image. Inside of Lightroom or in Camera Raw, if you are working that way, in theory, it's a very similar process, but in fact, it involves a split toning. And so if we go up to the split toning set of adjustments here, then we can see the options that are available. I'll talk about split toning in a moment, but first, let's just focus on a single color. And so if I increase the saturation for my highlights color, I can increase the value for balance so that only the highlight color is being used. I'll show you this split toning in a moment. I can then go find the color I want. So let's say I wanted kind of a cyan type of a color. Then, of course, I can reduce the value for saturation. So I'll crank up that saturation a bit, shift the balance to just the highlights since I'm working with the highlights. And then once I've found the actual color using that hue slider, then I can reduce the value for saturation to get a more appropriate final result. In addition, however, we can work with split toning. And so I was just working with split toning, of course, but with a single color, I can also use two colors. And so in the context of Lightroom, that would simply involve getting that balance back to somewhere closer to 0, and then increasing the saturation for the shadows. And so just to make it extreme, I'll make kind of a magenta for the shadows and a greenish value for the highlights. I'll oversaturate both of them just so you can see the effect a little bit better. But I could also shift the balance, more highlight color, more shadow color, or only shadow color, or only highlight color, again, depending on the specific positive or negative value that I'm using there. What about in Photoshop? Well, things start to get a little bit tricky because the black and white adjustment only gives me a single color for the tint. And if I go adjust my original image to be a split-toned version, then the black and white adjustment is simply going to convert that right back to a black and white with no color. And so instead I would create a stamp visible layer. And to do that, I'll go ahead and delete the layer just so that you can see what it was like beforehand. I simply hold the Control, Alt, and Shift keys on Windows or the Command, Option, and Shift keys on Macintosh. In other words, all three of the normal modifier keys. And then this isn't necessarily required depending on which types of layers you have, but as a general practice, holding those three keys, press the letter N for a new layer. That's not necessarily required. It just depends on the types of layers you have. And then the letter E, still holding those three modifier keys on the keyboard. That gives us what's called a stamp visible layer, essentially a copy of everything down below represented in a single layer. And then once again, I can use that Camera Raw filter. We've already seen the split toning that's available within Lightroom. So if we were working within Lightroom, then we've got a variety of different adjustments that are available there. The split toning controls are also available inside of Adobe Camera Raw, so within the Camera Raw filter in this case, exactly the same thing. So I could go find, oh, maybe for the highlights, I'll use maybe a shade of blue, just increase the saturation so I can actually see the effect. And then for the shadows, maybe I'll use kind of more of a bit of a magenta. And then I can also shift the balance if I want more of one color versus the other. And then, of course, tone down the overall saturation. And so I could, for example, warm up the highlights and cool down the shadows. I've got all sorts of options for how I interpret the actual color tinting effect. But again, that ability to have more than one color. We could even go to a further extreme and add a gradient map adjustment layer inside of Photoshop, where we've got all sorts of possibilities in terms of how we interpret essentially a split toning effect that involves many, many more colors. All right, before we wrap up today, I will address some questions in just a moment as well. I know we've had a few questions along the way, and I'll get to those. But I also want to talk about third-party tools and why I would use third-party tools and the benefits that they provide. Now, obviously, we've been focusing on the tools that I find photographers use the most, some of the most important adjustments in the context of your black and white images and how you interpret them. But, of course, there are tools beyond Lightroom and Photoshop. One of those, I know we've had a couple of questions about the Nik collection from Google, and in particular Silver Efex Pro, which is no longer available. Google has officially announced that they're discontinuing. There will be no more updates, and so it's only a matter of time before those plugins no longer work for the various software tools we're using. So we need to find alternatives. In terms of black and white, one of the tools that I've been using and that I've been very happy with is Luminar from MacFun Software. There is a Windows version coming soon. The Macintosh version is currently available, and I can use that as a plugin or as a standalone. And so here I'm just using it as a plugin within Photoshop. And I'm not going to go in depth. Of course, we're almost out of time, and I want to make sure to get to some questions. But I want to show you one of the key advantages. Now, to begin with, many of these third-party tools, in the context of Luminar, for example, have a variety of more sophisticated adjustment controls. So, for example, going beyond just clarity and having this ability to enhance the overall structure with a variety of more enhanced controls that go beyond what would be possible in Lightroom or Photoshop without a lot of work with various adjustment layers and layer masks inside and a variety of special techniques inside of Photoshop. So to be sure, some of these third-party software tools enable you to have more sophisticated adjustment controls. And I would certainly say that Luminar is right up there at the top of the list in terms of providing some sophisticated tools for optimizing your photos. But one of the more important benefits, it's a small thing, but I think it's an important thing, is that these third-party tools very often do a really great job of having a variety of presets that you can choose from. And so here, for example, inside of Luminar, we have a variety of different presets, and you can see I'm working with a color image, of course, and I have a whole bunch of possible interpretations. Keep in mind, all of these presets simply relate to the other adjustment controls that are available within the software. Just like in Lightroom and in other software tools, the presets are not any sort of magic in terms of special adjustments that you couldn't otherwise access, but rather they are shortcuts to a variety of different adjustments you might have applied yourself. The big benefit there is that, number one, it can make it a lot quicker and easier for you to get to that finished point, but also, what I find tremendously valuable is that it gives you some creative inspiration. So maybe you weren't even thinking about black and white for this image, and then you go through some of the various presets that are available and you say, oh wow, that's really interesting. Maybe I like this particular interpretation of the image, for example. And so I can use those presets as inspiration for possibilities. Here's a soft black and white versus a film noir effect, which is very dramatic. And so I can use these as inspiration. Notice, by the way, one of the features that I love about Luminar is that with this preset, I can tone down the effect. Now, in the context of a black and white image, of course, that means that the color will start to come through a little bit, but I can also go over to my adjustment controls over on the right side here and fine tune and refine all of those. And so here, for example, I have some of my favorites in terms of black and white interpretations. I can use all of these different presets just as a starting point. And keep in mind, there might be something here like, ooh, I like this. It's just a bit too strong. And so maybe I use this as the starting point and then I tone down the grain, because let's not forget, when I was doing black and white film photography, I was trying to avoid grain at all costs. And I might tone down that clarity just a little bit. And even more so, I might take a look at some of the other effects that are enhancing overall contrast, etc. But again, the point being is that I still have full control, but I have that added benefit of the potential efficiency of working with the presets, but more importantly, that additional creative inspiration, so that we can then find new ways of interpreting our photos that we might have otherwise forgot about, neglected, not anticipated, not thought about, or not thought would have worked with the image that we're currently working with. Maybe we weren't even thinking of black and white, and then some of those presets show us that actually this image could work very nicely in black and white. So we have a little bit of time here to address a few questions. I'll try to get to as many of those as I possibly can. In the meantime, many of you already know that in addition to the GreyLearning webinar series, we do produce a wide variety of video training courses that are available in the GreyLearning library. So if you'd like to learn even more and get a discounted price on the full bundle of all of the video courses, I have lost count of just how many hours of video content is included in the GreyLearning Ultimate Bundle. If you go to timgray.me/GreyBundle99, you'll get a discount and the opportunity to immediately access a wide variety of video training courses. So let's take a look at a few questions in terms of, well, let's see, where in Photoshop is it setting for 8-bit versus 16-bit? First off, from Bob. So inside of Photoshop, if you're working with a raw capture, of course, you would set that bit depth within Adobe Camera Raw when you were initially processing. The actual image mode, let me go ahead and just quit Luminar here so that I can get back to my normal mode within Photoshop. So under image mode, we have 8 bits versus 16 bits. However, if you're working with an 8-bit per channel image, converting to 16 bits will not give you any additional information. Most cameras today are capturing 14-bit per channel information, some 12, some 16. All of those get put into a 16-bit per channel package, if you will. But starting with an 8-bit per channel image and converting it to 16 bits per channel does not give you any real advantage in terms of the amount of information that you're starting with. Michelle asks, she says she's sometimes torn over whether to work with an image in color or black and white. Can you review some of the decision criteria? Yes, first and foremost, I would say that there are often situations where color is getting in the way. And so, for example, if you'll recall the stairs here in Rome, so here the color was just distracting. In other situations, I would say that black and white is adding a sense of age for an old subject. So sometimes the color is creating problems or is distracting. Maybe you just can't get the color to look right, or you want that sense of sort of timelessness, or you simply want to enhance texture. So here's a sense of age, a sense of moodiness, a sense of I don't want to distract anything at all. Now, in the case of the Oculus, it's white anyhow, but I want to make sure there's no hint of color at all, because it's all about the texture, the drama of the geometry, if you will. And so there are a variety of scenarios. The other would be just enhancing overall texture, where the texture is the most important reason that you captured the photo in the first place. So a variety of reasons, but I would also say, remember the canola field here. Play around with it every now and then. Every now and then you got a little bit of time on your hands. You're feeling like you need a little bit of a creative inspiration. Go look at some images that you felt they were captured or that they really inspired you because they were in color. Try converting them to black and white and see what you end up with. I think you might be surprised. There is something unique, captivating, and special about a black and white image. And so I do recommend playing around a little bit and getting more familiar with what might be possible. A lot of this just comes down to experience and playing around, honestly. Some of that play is the best way to find new ways of interpreting your photos and to produce better images in the process. So Patricia has a great question here. Does lowering the value of a color in black and white add noise? So not exactly, but it is possible. So let's go find an example here real quick. If I work on an image, we can run into some problems if we get a little bit too extreme. So I'm going to convert this image to a black and white. And if I say, oh, well, I want an infrared type of effect. So I'm going to brighten up the yellows and the greens, and I'm going to darken down the blues and the aquas. What you will very often discover then is that we start to get a little bit of noise and we see a little bit of posterization. It might be difficult to see through the webinar broadcast here, but we'll see that the quality suffers significantly. I don't know if you can necessarily see there's some vertical bands here. That is amplification noise from the camera. There's some posterization in these areas of the sky. We might also see some odd transitions along edges. Here it's not too bad, but in some cases we'll get a little bit of a halo because we've gone a little bit too far. Bearing in mind that when it's the blues in particular, there's less information on the blue channel to start with, and so there's more risk of noise there. So yes, applying extreme adjustments to those channels, to any of them really, but I would say the blues tend to be the more significant problem, and usually darkening because it helps to accentuate the level of detail and the potential for noise. If we're brightening, things start to brighten up. Yes, in theory, you're seeing more detail, but it also starts to kind of get a little less obvious visually. And so when we're brightening, it tends to be less of an issue. Now, of course, if we had dark shadows and we're brightening those up, then those dark shadows may very well end up having some visible noise as a result. All right, let's take a look and see if we have maybe one or two questions here before we wrap up for the day. Let's see here. When I want grain added, most programs will add noise, but not grain. That's a fair point. I would argue that grain really is noise, essentially. Remember, luminance noise is random variations in luminance values, and grain is essentially random variations in luminance values. They're essentially the same thing. Let me zoom in here. The difference is the overall structure, and so if I increase the value for grain here, initially it looks like noise, but now if we start to dabble a little bit with our overall settings, so increasing the size, for example, as well as the roughness, we start to get something that resembles a little bit more in the way of grain structure. But quite frankly, it's still going to be interpreted, especially by modern day photographers, if you will, it will still be interpreted as noise. And so grain, frankly, can be a little bit tricky unless you're trying to create a very dramatic effect. If I take this grain back to, a more modest level, yes, there is a grain structure there, but it's mostly going to be interpreted as noise. So what I would say is that the main reason that you might add grain, in other words, adding a little bit of luminance noise, is to give that image just a little bit of a sense of texture. And not the texture in terms of the detail of the subject matter, but just the overall image. Sometimes, as crazy as this might sound, a digital image, especially in black and white, can look a little bit too smooth, and so just a tiny little application of grain can actually work very nicely. So Brooke, great question. Do you process infrared the same way? So I kind of made reference to this fake infrared. If you're truly interested in infrared, I highly recommend that you get one of your cameras converted so that it's actually able to capture infrared images. And what that generally means is removing the infrared cutoff filter. So most image sensors have a filter that blocks infrared light to help avoid aberrations of other types. And then you need to add either onto the sensor or onto the lens an infrared filter. The basic rules are still the same, and there the only difference I would say is that there's really no benefit to retaining an RGB image. You don't need to keep the image in color because there's not really any useful color information there to begin with. With an infrared capture, we're going so far to the end of the spectrum beyond, at least in theory, the visible spectrum, so that we now don't have any color information. So as far as I'm concerned, if you're capturing with a camera that's been converted to infrared, there's no need to keep that color information. You could just convert it to black and white right from the start if you prefer to. But otherwise, by and large, the theory is the same, except you don't have that color information. So now it's purely luminance information. And so you would use things like a curves adjustment, for example, or even targeted adjustments in order to apply luminance changes in specific areas as needed. All right, I want to thank you all once again for joining me today for this presentation. I hope that you have found it informative, maybe a little entertaining, and even inspirational, and that it will help you to create better black and white images as a result. Thanks very much for joining, and be sure to stay tuned for future presentations as part of the GreyLearning webinar series sponsored by Tamron. Thanks very much, everyone.